The night air over Constantinople was heavy, with the scent of burning pitch and the salt of the Bosporus. Torches flickered along the mighty Theodosian walls, their flames mirrored in the restless eyes of men who had not slept in days. Priests carried icons through the streets, chanting prayers that mingled with the distant rumble of Ottoman cannon. Mothers pressed their children close, whispering that the Virgin herself would shield the city, as she had for 1,000 years. But the omens were grim. From the sea, the hulking shadows of enemy ships filled the horizon. From the land, campfires stretched endlessly, like a second city of flames surrounding them. And at the heart of that encircling inferno was a young Sultan, Mehmet II, only 21, but already a man who carried the weight of destiny. Inside the walls, Emperor Constantine XI Paleologus walked the halls of the Blachernae Palace. His footsteps echoed in chambers, once graced by Justinian, Basil, and 100 emperors before him. He knew he was the last. Around him hung silken banners faded with age, and marble statues chipped and broken, relics of an empire that had once ruled the world. Now he had fewer than 7,000 defenders to stand against more than 80,000 Ottomans. The stage was set for the final act of Byzantium, the city that had stood for more than 1,000 years. Within weeks, its fate would be sealed forever. Dawn broke over Constantinople with a thin, pale light, glinting off the domes and spires that still gave the city its name. Queen of cities. Yet the grandeur was a fading illusion. The once mighty Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the capital itself and a few scraps of territory. The streets still bustled with merchants, monks, and pilgrims, but the wealth of old, the caravans of silk, the treasures of Africa and Asia, now flowed through Venetian and Genoese hands. The Byzantine coffers were nearly empty, and the soldiers who guarded the walls were mercenaries, loyal more to coin than to crown. Constantine XI Paleologos, the last emperor, knew the truth as he climbed the steps of Hagia Sophia for prayer. He was not merely an emperor, he was the last heir of Constantine the Great, ruler of 1,000 years of history, a man born into decline. His ancestors had seen the empire torn apart by crusaders, weakened by civil wars, devoured piece by the Ottomans. But still, he carried himself with dignity. Contemporary chronicles say he was neither tall nor handsome, yet in his bearing was the gravity of fate. He believed he had been chosen not to save Byzantium but to die with it. Far to the east, across the Bosporus, another man carried destiny with him, a boy who had grown into a conqueror. Mehmet II had been born into the Ottoman dynasty at a time when the empire was already strong, stretching across Anatolia and the Balkans. But strength alone was not enough for him. At 13, he had briefly taken the throne after his father abdicated, only to be humiliated when enemies threatened the empire and his father had to return to save it. The boy never forgot that taste of failure. By 21, Mehmet was different, hardened, ambitious, consumed by a vision. He would be the one to claim Constantinople, the city that had eluded every Muslim army since the days of the Prophet. Ottoman poets whispered that he was destined to fulfill a prophecy, that one day a great leader would bring down the walls of Byzantium. Mehmet had convinced himself he was that leader. He prepared meticulously. While Constantine scraped together coins to pay mercenaries, Mehmet poured the riches of his empire into a single purpose: siege. His engineers forged cannon of unprecedented size, massive bronze monsters that could hurl stone balls weighing more than half a ton. One such weapon, built by a Hungarian cannon maker named Orban, was so vast that 60 oxen were needed to haul it across the countryside. Villagers fled at the sound of its first test, a thunderous roar that split the air like judgment itself. The city's defenders laughed nervously when they heard rumors of this cannon. Theodosian walls had stood since the 5th century, 3 lines of stone and mortar that had shrugged off every attacker for 1,000 years. Huns, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Crusaders. Surely they could withstand one young sultan's toy. But in truth, they knew the old stones had begun to crumble, patched in haste after earthquakes, undermanned by soldiers. As Mehmet prepared his army, Constantine scrambled for allies. He sent pleas to Rome, Venice, and Genoa. But Europe was weary of crusades. France was torn by the 100 Years' War. England was bleeding from civil strife, and the papacy demanded submission to Catholic authority before aid could come. Constantine agreed, knowing it would anger many of his Orthodox subjects. When papal envoys arrived, Hagia Sophia saw a solemn, uneasy union service. Greek priests standing alongside Latin cardinals, the ancient schism papered over by desperation. Some Byzantines spat at the compromise, calling it betrayal. Better the turban of the Sultan, they muttered, than the tiara of the Pope. By the spring of 1453, the armies were in motion. Across the Bosporus, the Ottoman camp grew day by day, a forest of tents, banners snapping in the wind, horses stamping in the mud. 80,000 soldiers, janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, Anatolian infantry, engineers, and sailors. The city within the walls could muster barely 7,000 fighting men, half of them foreign mercenaries. From the Tower of Galata across the Golden Horn, Genoese merchants watched with unease. They had business on both sides, trade with Byzantium, contracts with the Ottomans. Some whispered that they would simply stand aside and see who won. Others promised to fight. The fate of an empire hung on uncertain loyalties. And then, one April morning, Mehmet's banners appeared on the horizon. Drums thundered, horns blared, and the young sultan rode at the head of his army. The earth shook with their march. He gazed at the domes of Constantinople, glittering in the sun, and swore before his men, "I will be either emperor in the city or emperor under the earth." The siege had begun. The first cannon blast rolled across Constantinople like thunder from an angry god. Windows rattled in their frames, birds scattered from the rooftops, and men on the walls crossed themselves instinctively. For a moment, silence followed. Then the impact. A stone ball the size of a small cart smashed into the outer wall, shattering stone and flinging dust and fragments high into the air. The people of the city gasped. Never before had they heard such a sound. The walls that had stood for centuries were trembling. Day after day, the bombardment continued. The Ottomans placed their giant cannon at St. Romanus Gate, the weakest section of the wall, and fired relentlessly. Each shot took hours to prepare, powder rammed, the stone ball hoisted into place, wet clay packed to prevent cracks. When it finally fired, the ground itself seemed to convulse. One Venetian eyewitness wrote, "The very earth shook, as if struck by lightning, and the air was filled with a roar greater than any storm." But Constantinople did not crumble easily. As fast as the stones fell, citizens and soldiers rushed to repair them with wood, earth, and rubble. Women carried baskets of soil, monks hauled beams, children dragged stones. At night, when the bombardment paused, torches lit up the breaches as Byzantines patched wounds in their ancient armor. By dawn, Mehmet's soldiers would find the gap filled again, and the cannons had to begin their work anew. It was a war of attrition, iron against determination. Inside the city, morale teetered between fear and faith. Hagia Sophia resounded with chants. Icons were paraded along the walls, and priests declared that angels stood ready to defend the Queen of Cities. Yet in the taverns and markets, whispers spread. Could the walls hold? Could God still favor them? Mehmet, watching from his command tent, grew impatient. He was not a man to be slowed by stubborn stones. He unleashed wave after wave of assaults, hurling his irregular troops at the breaches. They came with ladders, hooks, and cries of, Allah Akbar, scrambling up under a rain of arrows, stones, and boiling oil. The defenders fought with desperate ferocity. Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani led the front lines, armored in steel, rallying both Greeks and foreigners alike. Wherever the fight was fiercest, his banner appeared. A red cross on a white field, the assaults broke like waves against rock. Dead piled at the foot of the walls. Arrows jutted from the earth like black reeds. But each failed assault only hardened Mehmet's resolve. He was not here for a raid. He was here to erase Byzantium from the map. Then came one of his boldest moves. He ordered his fleet, more than 100 ships, to enter the Golden Horn, the sheltered harbor of Constantinople. But the entrance was blocked by a massive iron chain stretched across the water, anchored by the Genoese Tower of Galata. The chain had stopped navies for centuries. So Mehmet turned to ingenuity. In one of history's most audacious maneuvers, he ordered ships to be dragged overland. Logs were greased with animal fat, planks laid down, and hundreds of oxen and men heaved the vessels across the hills behind Galata. On a single night, under cover of darkness, entire galleys slid over the earth like sleds, lanterns lighting their ghostly passage. At dawn, the people of Constantinople woke to horror. Ottoman ships floating inside their harbor, bypassing the chain completely. The shock was devastating. The Golden Horn, once the city's safe flank, was now vulnerable. Panic spread among the defenders, some declaring it a sign that God had abandoned them. Constantine rode along the walls, calming his soldiers, reminding them that the city had faced worse and endured. His words steadied hearts, but he knew the truth. Every advantage was slipping away. Still, the defenders fought on. When Ottoman miners tunneled beneath the walls, Greek engineers dug countermines, breaking into the tunnels and setting them ablaze with pitch and sulfur. At night, the sky glowed red from burning siege towers. The city was ringed by fire and thunder, yet still it held. Mehmet grew restless. He was wasting time, men, and prestige. Yet his vision of empire demanded victory. He summoned his commanders and declared, if cannon and stratagems failed, then the city must fall by sheer force of arms. A final assault would be prepared, one that would either make him emperor in the city or leave him dead beneath its walls. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI also understood what was coming. He gathered his nobles and foreign allies in the palace hall. By candlelight, with shadows flickering on the ancient mosaics, he spoke with calm gravity. My brothers, the moment has come. In this city we were born. In this city we must die. Let us not disgrace ourselves with fear. For centuries our fathers defended these walls, and we are their heirs. If we fall, let it be as men who died for faith, for empire, for honor. The defenders bowed their heads. The last emperor had bound them together, not with promises of victory, but with the nobility of sacrifice. The stage was set for the final night, May 28, 1453. The day ended in firelight, the sky over Constantinople painted crimson by the setting sun. On the hills beyond the walls, the Ottoman camp glowed like a second city, tens of thousands of torches flickering against the dusk. The rumble of drums, steady as a heartbeat, rolled across the fields. Trumpets blared, and from time to time voices shouted takbir in unison. Allah Akbar! The sound carried over the ramparts, chilling the defenders. Blood. Inside the walls, the city prepared for what everyone knew was the end. Shops were shuttered. Taverns closed. Bells rang from every church tower, summoning the faithful to prayer. Even the most hardened soldiers came barefoot to Hagia Sophia, where the great basilica, ancient as the empire itself, filled with thousands of men, women, and children. The vast dome echoed with chanting, incense smoke curling like mist around mosaics of Christ and the Virgin. Candles blazed in their thousands, a forest of flames defying the darkness. For the first time in centuries, Greeks and Latins stood side by side at the altar. The schism between Eastern and Western churches was momentarily forgotten. The emperor himself walked among them, not in jeweled regalia but in plain armor, his sword at his side. He received communion with his soldiers, bowed before the altar, and then turned to face his people. His voice carried across the nave, steady, solemn. Tomorrow we fight not for victory, for victory belongs only to God, but for honor. If we must fall, let us fall as Christians, as Romans, as men worthy of our ancestors. I ask forgiveness of all whom I have wronged, as I forgive those who have wronged me. Men wept openly. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Even mercenaries who had come for pay bowed their heads, moved by the dignity of the doomed emperor. One chronicler wrote that never had Hagia Sophia seen a service so filled with both sorrow and majesty. After midnight, Constantine rode the walls for the last time. Torches lit his path as he inspected the defenses, speaking words of encouragement to weary soldiers. He clasped hands, gave blessings, and reminded them of their duty. Some knelt as he passed, as if he were already a martyr. In one account, he told Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, "Tomorrow, my brother, we shall both have crowns, you in victory, I in death." Meanwhile, in the Ottoman camp, Mehmet prepared his men. He rode before his janissaries, elite soldiers in white turbans, their armor gleaming in the firelight. He spoke of prophecy, how the prophet himself had promised paradise to the conqueror of Constantinople. He promised riches, slaves, and eternal glory to those who stormed the walls. The army erupted in cheers, pounding shields with their swords. They believed destiny was theirs. Omens haunted the night. Over the city a pale light appeared in the sky, the full moon, veiled by clouds so that it looked blood red. Some said it was the Virgin leaving her city. Others claimed it was the sword of Islam shining upon Mehmet. In Hagia Sophia, a strange glow was reported around the dome, seen even from outside the walls. Later generations would say it was the Holy Spirit departing forever. As the night deepened, the city fell into uneasy silence. Families huddled in their homes, whispering prayers. Soldiers dozed in their armor on the ramparts, clutching swords and crossbows. The sea lay black and still, broken only by the creak of Ottoman galleys waiting in the Horn. Dogs barked in the distance, then fell quiet, as if even animals sensed what was coming. In the palace, Constantine prepared alone. He wrote a last letter, sealed it, and gave it to a trusted servant with instructions to escape if possible. He donned his armor carefully, mail shirt, breastplate, greaves, but left aside the imperial purple. That night, he would not die as a distant emperor, but as a soldier among soldiers. When the bells struck the final hour before dawn, he mounted his horse once more and rode to the St. Romanus Gate, where the heaviest bombardment had struck. There he dismounted, raised his sword, and spoke to the defenders who gathered around him in the dim light of torches. "Brothers, the time has come. Tomorrow, when they break upon us, remember, this is our city, our faith, our families. Fight with courage, for the eyes of heaven are upon us." A hush followed. Then the soldiers cheered, banging weapons against shields, their voices echoing into the night. Across the plain, Ottoman drums thundered louder, faster, like the approach of a storm. Trumpets blared. Shadows moved in the torchlight as ranks formed. The siege was about to end. And with the first gray light of dawn, the last battle for Constantinople began. The dawn of May 29, 1453, broke with fire. Before the sun had fully risen, the Ottoman drums thundered, a deafening rhythm that shook the very stones of the walls. Trumpets blared, and voices rose in unison. "Allah Akbar! Allah Akbar!" 3 waves of assault were planned. First, the irregulars, a tide of conscripts, mercenaries and adventurers thrown forward to exhaust the defenders. Behind them, Anatolian troops would press the attack, supported by scaling ladders and siege engines. And finally, the Janissaries, Mehmet's most disciplined, fanatical soldiers, would deliver the killing blow. The first wave surged forward like a human flood. Men scrambled up the rubble of shattered walls, shields raised against arrows and stones. Greek and Genoese defenders poured fire into them, bolts from crossbows, musket shots, flaming pitch hurled from above. Arrows fell like rain, shields splintered, ladders toppled. Hundreds fell, impaled on stakes or crushed beneath tumbling stones. The survivors broke and fled, leaving the ground littered with bodies. But the Ottomans were relentless. The second wave marched in behind them, drums never ceasing, voices crying out in prayer. This time they came more organized, with shields interlocked, ladders placed quickly, scaling hooks biting into the walls. The fighting grew desperate. Defenders thrust spears downward, chopped with axes, fired point-blank into faces that appeared above the parapets. The air filled with screams, smoke, and the smell of blood. Still, the Anatolians could not break through. Constantine rode from point to point, shouting encouragement, his armor blackened with soot. Giustiniani stood at the St. Romanus gate, directing defense with tireless energy. Wherever he appeared, morale stiffened, and the attackers faltered. For hours the battle raged, and still the city held. Then Mehmet unleashed his final weapon, the Janissaries. They advanced in perfect silence, a wall of white turbans and gleaming steel until the drums crashed and they broke into a charge. Their discipline was terrifying. Unlike the earlier waves, they did not falter under arrows or falling stones. They climbed, cut, and hacked, driving ever upward. It was then disaster struck the defenders. Giustiniani, the Genoese captain, was wounded. Some say by a bullet, others by a spear. He collapsed, bleeding heavily, and his men carried him from the walls. The sight spread panic. Soldiers who had fought bravely all night suddenly faltered. Whispers ran, "Giustiniani is gone. The gate will fall." Constantine, realizing the moment, rushed to the breach. He fought with sword in hand, urging his men to stand. Chroniclers say he cried out, "The city is lost, but I live," and plunged into the melee. The Janissaries pressed harder. A small postern gate, left unsecured near the Blacherny quarter, was forced open. Ottoman troops poured inside, flanking the defenders. Confusion spread. The cry went up, "The Turks are in the city!" From that moment, the defense unraveled. Some fought to the death on the walls. Others fled toward the harbor, hoping for ships. Citizens rushed to the churches, clutching icons, praying for miracles that would not come. On the ramparts, Constantine fought like a common soldier. Witnesses later swore they saw him cut down several attackers before he was surrounded. He tore the imperial insignia from his armor, refusing to be taken alive. His final words were said to be, "The city has fallen, and I am its emperor." Then he vanished into the crush of battle, never seen again. His body was never found. By mid-morning, the Ottomans swarmed the walls. Their banners, the red standard of Mehmet, the green flag of Islam, rose above the towers. Trumpets blared. Drums pounded in triumph. The gates were thrown open, and Mehmet's army poured into Constantinople. The queen of cities had fallen. Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, became the refuge of thousands. Men, women, and children crowded inside, kneeling before the altar, priests chanting desperately. Then the doors crashed open, and Ottoman soldiers stormed in. The chanting ceased. The church that had stood as the heart of the Byzantine world was silenced. Outside, the streets filled with chaos. Soldiers rampaged, taking plunder, rounding up prisoners, setting fires. The air was thick with smoke and cries. For 3 days, the ancient city that had been Rome's last heir was subjected to the conqueror's law. At midday, Mehmet entered through the St. Romanus Gate, riding at the head of his janissaries. He halted before the ruins of the walls, gazing at the devastation. He dismounted, bent down, and scooped a handful of earth, sprinkling it on his turban in humility before God. Then he rode through the streets to Hagia Sophia, now his prize. There, standing before the great dome, he declared it a mosque. The age of Byzantium was ended. The age of Ottoman Constantinople had begun. The drums still pounded as the call to prayer rose over the city for the first time. The echo of church bells had been replaced. 1,000 years of empire had died in a single morning. When the walls were breached and resistance shattered, Constantinople became a city of shadows. Smoke curled from burning houses, the cries of the conquered echoing through once proud avenues. The Mies, the great central road that had seen triumphal processions of emperors for 1,000 years, now ran with blood and dust. Ottoman soldiers surged through the streets, seizing plunder. Gold icons were ripped from churches, silks torn from noble houses, treasures that had survived centuries of siege and fire carried off in an instant. People were herded like livestock. Men bound for slavery in Anatolia, women and children dragged into captivity. Chroniclers wrote of 3 days of sack, as was customary in conquest, a grim reward for the victors. In Hagia Sophia, the vast dome still glowed faintly with the smoke of extinguished candles. Thousands had crowded inside, hoping for sanctuary. But when the doors crashed open, the great basilica became a prison. Priests clutched their crosses, women screamed, children wept. The chanting ceased forever as the invaders stormed the altar, shattering centuries-old mosaics, tearing down the jeweled icons of Christ and the Virgin. The holiest space of Byzantium became the spoil of war. Yet, amid the violence, one figure moved with eerie calm: Mehmet II. When the sack was done, he summoned his commanders and ordered order restored. The soldiers obeyed, their looting ended, the captives gathered. He rode through the ruined streets, surveying his prize with a young conqueror's awe. He was only 21, yet here he stood, master of a city emperors and caliphs had coveted for a millennium. At Hagia Sophia, he dismounted and entered alone. Dust hung in the air, light filtering down through the colossal dome. He looked up at the mosaics, angels, saints, the Christ Pantocrator gazing down from eternity, and whispered words of prayer. Then he ordered a muezzin to climb the pulpit and give the call to prayer. The Christian basilica was transformed into a mosque. Mehmet bent his forehead to the ground in prostration. A new age had begun. For the conquered Greeks, it was the end of the world. Emperor Constantine XI was gone. His body never recovered, his fate wrapped in legend. Some said he had been buried beneath the city walls by angels, waiting to rise again. Others whispered that he had been spotted fleeing across the sea, still alive, still emperor. But in truth he had perished sword in hand, and with him the last ember of Rome's empire was extinguished. In the weeks that followed, Mehmet set about reshaping his prize. He renamed it Istanbul, the city of Islam. He welcomed back merchants and artisans, promising them protection and prosperity. He declared that Hagia Sophia would remain, but as the jewel of his empire, the great mosque of his capital. He restored order where chaos had ruled, for Mehmet was not only a conqueror, he was a builder, a visionary who dreamed of making his city the heart of the world. Europe, meanwhile, reeled in shock. The fall of Constantinople was more than the death of a city, it was the death of an idea. For 1,000 years, Byzantium had been the bulwark between East and West, the guardian of Christendom against Islam. Now that bulwark was gone, panic swept across kingdoms. In Rome, the Pope wept and called for a new crusade. In Venice and Genoa, merchants counted their losses, fearful of Ottoman control over trade. In monasteries, chroniclers dipped quills in ink and wrote, "The world has ended. The empire of the Romans is no more." And yet, from the ashes, new currents of history flowed. Greek scholars fled west, carrying with them ancient manuscripts, texts of Plato, Aristotle, and forgotten thinkers preserved in Byzantine libraries. These works would ignite the flames of the Renaissance, fueling Europe's rebirth of science, art, and philosophy. Constantinople had fallen, but its knowledge was reborn in Florence, Venice, and beyond. For the Ottomans, victory was only the beginning. Istanbul became the capital of an empire that would stretch for centuries, a city where East met West, where sultans raised domes to rival Hagia Sophia, and armies marched to the gates of Vienna. Mehmet, now styled the Conqueror, was hailed as Caesar and Caliph alike. He had claimed both Roman and Islamic legacies, binding them to his own ambition. But for the Greeks, the memory never faded. Songs were sung of the last emperor who had died with his people. Prayers whispered of a day when the city would be free again. For generations, they called it simply the polis, the city, as if no other place in the world mattered. On that May morning in 1453, one empire had ended, another begun. The stones of Constantinople bore witness, scarred by cannon and fire, yet still standing. And in the silence that followed, one truth was clear. The world had changed forever. When the dust settled over Constantinople, the world seemed different. The Byzantine banners of the double-headed eagle no longer fluttered from its towers. The cross no longer gleamed from Hagia Sophia's dome. For the first time in 1,000 years, Rome's eastern half was gone. Yet the consequences of its fall rippled far beyond the Bosporus. For Europe, the shock was visceral. Cities rang church bells in mourning. Sermons thundered that the end of days was at hand. In Rome, Pope Nicholas V declared the loss of Constantinople a second death of Troy. Preachers in France and Germany called for crusades, though few kings had the money or will to raise armies. Europe was weary, fractured by wars of its own. Yet one fear united them. The Ottomans would not stop. Indeed, Mehmet's ambitions soared higher. With Constantinople as his capital, he declared himself Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome. His court chroniclers wrote that he was heir not only to the prophet, but to Augustus and Constantine. He ordered the repair of aqueducts, the revival of markets, and the building of palaces that fused Byzantine and Ottoman style. He dreamed of advancing further into Europe, turning the Danube into his frontier, and perhaps even reaching Rome itself. The fall also transformed trade. For centuries, Constantinople had been Europe's gateway to the riches of the East, silks from China, spices from India, gems from Persia. Now, under Ottoman control, that gateway narrowed. Taxes rose, access tightened, and merchants grew restless. Italian traders who once dominated the eastern Mediterranean began to search for alternatives, and in doing so, they turned their eyes to the seas. It was this hunger for new routes that sent ships westward. In Lisbon, Prince Henry's navigators plotted ways around Africa. In Genoa, a sailor named Christopher Columbus dreamed of reaching Asia by crossing the Atlantic. In Florence, bankers calculated the fortunes to be made if someone could bypass the Ottoman chokehold. Thus, in the ashes of Byzantium's fall, the seeds of the age of exploration were sown. Meanwhile, in Europe's universities and monasteries, a quieter revolution took root. Refugees from Constantinople, scholars, monks, copyists, carried treasures more precious than gold, books. Manuscripts of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen, and countless others arrived in Venice, Florence, and Padua. They had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for centuries, guarded through invasions and fires. Now, in exile, they lit the flame of the Renaissance. Suddenly, Europe rediscovered its forgotten heritage. Artists like Botticelli and Leonardo sketched human forms with the precision of ancient masters. Mathematicians and astronomers pored over Greek texts, preparing the ground for Copernicus and Galileo. Philosophers debated Plato in candlelit halls, while architects built domes inspired by Hagia Sophia's curves. The knowledge saved in Constantinople became the lifeblood of Europe's rebirth. For the Greeks themselves, the memory of their lost capital became legend. They sang of Constantine XI, the last emperor, who had fallen with sword in hand. Some swore he had not died, but been turned to marble by angels, sleeping beneath the Golden Gate, waiting to rise again when the city was free. Mothers told children of the polis, the city, as if no other city truly existed. For centuries under Ottoman rule, Greek identity clung to the memory of that lost world, preserved in liturgy, in song, in whispered hope. The Ottomans, meanwhile, built their empire into one of history's great powers. From Istanbul, they ruled for nearly 500 years, their armies reaching the gates of Vienna, their fleets dominating the Mediterranean. Yet the fusion of Byzantine and Islamic traditions shaped their culture. Hagia Sophia stood not as a ruin, but as a living mosque, its dome resounding with the call to prayer, its mosaics hidden but never entirely erased. The conquerors had inherited not only walls and palaces, but 1,000 years of Roman legacy. And so the fall of Constantinople was not an ending, but a transformation. It marked the death of one empire and the birth of another. It shattered old routes, but opened to new worlds. It silenced the bells of Hagia Sophia, but ignited the Renaissance in Europe. On May 29, 1453, as Mehmet rode beneath the breached walls and Constantine fell among his soldiers, neither man could know how far the consequences would stretch. Yet in that moment, the medieval world ended and the modern one began. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was more than the end of a city. It was the passing of an age. For over 1,000 years, Byzantium had stood as the bridge between East and West, the heir of Rome, the bulwark of Christendom. When its walls finally gave way, the world was forced to change. For the Ottomans, it was the dawn of empire. Istanbul became the jewel of their dominion, a capital that would endure for centuries. For Europe, it was a wake-up call, a moment that shattered old certainties and drove explorers toward uncharted seas. For Greece, it was the beginning of centuries of longing, the dream of a city that lived on in song and memory. And for all of us, it remains a reminder that even the mightiest walls can fall, but their legacy can echo far beyond stone and mortar. Constantinople may have been conquered, but its spirit shaped the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and the world we inhabit today. On that morning in May, when the last emperor fell and the young sultan entered his prize, history turned a page. The medieval world ended. The modern one began.